We are thrilled to end our conference with Melissa Loble, who is the Chief Customer Experience Officer at Instructure. She has 20 years in the educational technology world, working for a number of technology suppliers and educational institutions in a variety of teaching and learning leadership capacities. She's also taught throughout her career, starting as a high school social science teacher, and most currently teaching courses that focus on managing technology for educational change and crafting innovative learning environments.
So hello, everyone. It's truly an honor to be here. My focus is a little bit of a future-looking view and potentially a wrap-up of some of the conversations that you've been experiencing earlier today. Some really great recommendations, suggestions, experiences being shared. I wanted to talk a little bit about how we think about a post-COVID world 1, 2, 3 years down the road, maybe even 5 years down the road, and how can we leverage the opportunities that we're facing now with this rapid transformation into an online learning world to really shape what that future is going to look like for all of us. So let's just dive right in. I'll be about 25-ish minutes, and then I'll make sure we have time for questions at the end as well. But COVID, as we've been talking about all day, has created an environment in which schools and institutions and learning organizations in general are forced to change pretty rapidly from traditional or more blended delivery modes to fully online delivery modes. And really, if we look and we think about what that transition has been, it's really been about how do we quickly get everything into a remote environment? How do we transition so that people can access learning experiences from home? And that's been the focus for many organizations and institutions. Now, there are some institutions that are beyond that point because they've been investing heavily over the last 10, 15, 20 years in a fully online experience as opposed to just a remote experience. But really, even they are now suddenly facing bringing all of their students and all of their instructors and all of their community members to that online environment. So in this era of rapid change, I challenge us all to think about how do we also grow? How do we not just change to adapt to our new world, but how do we use that new world as an opportunity to directly impact how we're delivering education as a whole? So in order to do that, I wanted to predict perhaps a little bit of what the future would look like. And I figured we could do a little bit of predicting together. Now, if we think about what that future might look like, we do need to take a look at some past. And I actually did a little bit of research to figure out all those futurists out there, how do they do their work? What's their methodology behind predicting the future? And they generally, and I'm going to use this as a very general example, look at past, look at patterns, look at what the world is saying today, add that all up together, do some analysis, and then start to make some future predictions. I sort of whittled it down into a very simple formula of let's take the past and patterns, add all of that together, multiply that by the signals that we're hearing today. What do we think is starting to emerge? And then hopefully we can come together and identify some predictions for the future. Now, the reason why I think it's important for us to think about predicting the future is, once again, we're able to then look at where we may go as educational organizations and institutions, and as organizations supporting education, as governments, as individual instructors like I am. We can think about all of that together and look at where we think we may be going and say, wow, how can I craft or change what I might be doing now to not just be responsive to the here and now, but to also be honoring where we would like to be in that future. So let's unpack this for me a little bit, talk a little bit about our past, some of the patterns that have happened in the past, and then let's look at those signals to make a couple of predictions at the end. Now, if we think about past and patterns, think about the last 15, 20 years in education. And this would be globally. Some countries, some regions have moved faster than others. I would say in some ways higher ed moved quickly out of the gate, and then K-12 followed, but then now K-12 is starting to ramp up in ways that higher ed is following. And so we've just got this world, though, of access. And in fact, access has been brought by the proliferation of both the internet, but even more importantly, quick and easy access, often via Wi-Fi. Now, I will talk in a few minutes about digital divide because I know not everyone has access, and we need to acknowledge that as part of what this future looks like, and we need to have plans for how we want to address that. But if we're just looking at past trends and history, this has been fundamental. And because of the way that education has now embraced access and bandwidth, we're able to actually do many of the things that we needed to do in response to COVID, and we can predict a really pretty interesting and pretty exciting future. Along with this proliferation of the internet, if we think about past and patterns, has also been the transition to do more with that. You know, if you think about technologies in the education space, they probably first went into cloud computing, but now we're seeing academic institutions and those supporting academic institutions also transitioning to cloud computing. This has an impact as well. This is an important moment in our past because it does, and patterns that we're seeing, because it does shape our ability to deliver some of these really exciting things that we could see in the future. It actually can make it easier. It can also make it more complex depending on how we rethink what we're doing, and we'll talk about that. But it is a key element of our past. Also, devices. So devices have become, and I don't mean just to be an Apple device example, although this was the example that I have, but devices is making a pretty significant impact on what we do now, but it has over the last 15, 10, and even 5 years. The fact that learners are coming not only with any one of the common devices that might be out there, but they're often learning on multiple devices. That creates both opportunities and a way to be thinking about the future, but it also can create some challenges in how we craft really valuable learning experiences. But regardless, this is a really key piece of our past and patterns that we're seeing. This accessible anywhere, anytime, on any device part of our pattern. Now, our patterns and our pasts in education aren't just about technology and how do we get online or how do we even go remote, but they're also about what kinds of trends are we seeing in how we teach or how we work or how we deliver education. So one key aspect of that is this idea of delivering education over non-traditional methods. Now, the non-traditional world, the non-traditional word is a struggle for me because it will mean something different every year because tradition changes. That said, if we want to think about the common understanding of traditional education, that would be an in-classroom based experience. Let's just use it as that. Typically either quarter, term, semester, there's some length to that traditional experience. If we're thinking now about some of the past and patterns that we've seen, what we've seen is that that's changed. We're now looking at first it was the proliferation of MOOCs in about 2012. Then that transitioned into micro degrees and nano degrees. Then that's transitioned into just individual learning elements aligned to badging. And that's now starting to turn into learner records and how are learners tracking those unique experiences, both experiential and traditionally academic. And then if you think in parallel to this, the advent of competency-based or outcomes-based learning, that is different and in parallel to this because it's about demonstrating your competencies and focusing on your skills and driving unique learning to that. So those are really key larger educational trends. And one that I didn't include a slide here for, but that's part of these educational trends is also the focus on student-centered learning or the focus on the learner. Now that's been embedded in learning theory for ages, but the importance of it or the focus of it has definitely increased in the last 10 to 15 years. Now, I say all of that as just a very generalized collection of pasts and patterns. We could go on for days around the advent of video conferencing, the advent of LMSs, the advent of the idea of chunking learning in more distinct ways. There's all sorts of other past and pattern trends, but these are probably some of the highlights of the last 10, 15 years. Now, they don't address the challenge around the digital divide, and we still are facing this, particularly in certain regions around the world, and even in certain areas within our own pockets of populations that we may live in that you would think or assume have access. Because it's not just about access to bandwidth and access to devices, it's also about access to understanding how to learn, access to support structures, access to the entire picture of learning or the entire process of learning in an equal and meaningful way. Now, from a bandwidth and device perspective, I didn't focus on that for this presentation. I do challenge all of us, though. There's lots of really great governmental initiatives going on as a result of COVID because of this rapid transformation into remote. I encourage you to participate in those, support those, look at your local communities, help make sure we can bring both bandwidth and devices, or encourage the companies that you patron to do things. We're seeing, for example, in the Philippines, the cell phone companies coming to provide free data access for learners because the country's infrastructure can't support remote learning. So I encourage you to get active and participate in those activities while we think about what we can do about the rest of that digital divide. How do we cross it when it comes to resources, access, the type of learning we're providing, the type of experiences and the way we're crafting those experiences we're providing. So that's our past and some patterns. Let's talk a little bit about signals and then let's jump into some of our predictions. So some of the signals, and I like to think of signals as what are we hearing now? We might not be all in every area. In some places we are for sure, but in other areas, there's lots of opportunity to sort of address these signals. And I also call them signals because they may change, or they may, vary in what they are producing. But these are things that we're hearing now that have come from the past that are really starting to become more mainstream. The first one of those is the focus on the individual. And when I say this, I don't mean the individual learner as in individualized learning or personalized learning, although that is a part of it. What I mean more is about a focus on the individual learner in all of the context, communities, and skill building desires that they exist in. So it's not just about how do I deliver the learning that's most effective for that person, but how do I engage that individual in the full environment in order to contextualize and apply that experience that we are generating. So this focus on the individual is critical. And I'm going to come back to it in my predictions, but there's also a human element to this that we need to be thinking about. It's focusing on the human, not just on the individual learner. And we'll come back to that. The second signal that we're seeing is a lot of dialogue around accessibility, privacy, and cybersecurity. Now, we have had a lot of dialogue around accessibility, and I would say as an education industry, we've made good strides. There's a lot more work to be done with accessibility, but that has been where we've started addressing some of the uniqueness of learners and how do we make sure they have access to the learning experiences that we're providing. What's really surfacing and has definitely exponentially surfaced during COVID is a focus on privacy and cybersecurity, or even data security. So what we're seeing is a dialogue between students and institutions, and even between students and institutions alongside or technology providers around how is data being used, why is data being used, what data is being used, who owns that data, how can I ensure that whomever owns that data, if some of that is my data, that it's protected. That dialogue is happening right now. I mean, if you think about some of the conversations that have been happening around Zoom and the safety and security and privacy around Zoom, you think about that around LMSs, there's mass amounts of data being collected on a learner. And the question is, how much of that should the learner control, the institution control, and the technology control? And there aren't answers yet. Folks haven't arrived. It's still an active debate. But it is a very important signal as we think about how do we craft and shape where we might want to go in the future. Our third signal is the leveraging of the technologies that we're seeing in the corporate space, or the innovations in technology as a whole, specifically in education. So examples like what's happening with artificial intelligence and machine learning as it applies within institutions, as well as within technologies that institutions are leveraging. Internet of Things as well. How are we leveraging that blockchain? How are we looking at how we're supporting perhaps learner records via the blockchain? There's so much happening out there that's now being grabbed from corporate industry and technology innovation that we're starting to tap into. Now, it does go back to Signal 2, and that's part of where some of the use of these, the debate is surfacing. But at the same time, we are seeing education start to dabble in these areas in order to address where we may go in the future, not just from a skills perspective, but from a how we deliver learning education perspective. I apologize for sneezing. And our fourth signal that I wanted to share is this concept of it's not just about the individual learner in their individual location and what's immediate around them, but it truly is a global world. Now, it's been a global world for a while. Thank you, technology, for getting us there, and thank you for the way the world interacts with one another. But it also is getting there because of some of the profound changes that are happening in the world as a whole, and particularly related to our economies. So it's now becoming about bridging continents, contexts, and communities all at once. And we're seeing this desire to have a learner be able to span all three of those while they're in their learning experience in order to be prepared for what the future may bring. Now, I've been really interested in the work that's been done around the fourth industrial revolution. We're in it, according to Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum. I think we've seen a lot of evidence of this in the last 2 to 3 years of how we are now in this fourth industrial revolution. But the fourth industrial revolution is about being able to leverage from, as he says, top down and bottom up, all that's happening across those continents and communities and contexts in order to address a pretty profound skills gap that's not only emerged, but will continue to grow in the next 3 to 5 years alone. If we think about the work that's now being done or the types of skills that are needed, institutions and educational supporters need not only to deliver what, not need only to utilize the incredible new workplace and new roles that technology versus people can play, but they also need to prepare their learners and their students for that. So this is the fourth big signal. It's not just about the technologies that are coming, the way we use those technologies and how we protect that data, and then how we work with that individual learner, but it's also about how do we path individual learners into a world that can be supported in what it's going to look like in 3 to 5 years. It's different. We're already feeling the rapid pace of change around us, and that only will be increased. Okay, so we've talked just very high level. There's a lot more signals out there that we could look at too to pull into this, but we've looked at the past and patterns. We've grabbed onto some signals. Let's make a little bit of a future prediction together. And I've got 5 predictions for us. And these predictions will help us think about how should we take all of the great learning that we've had today from the different sessions that you participated in, from all that's being shared in this era of COVID among institutions and among educators around how best to serve learners. How do we take all of that and point it in places where we may want to see pretty significant innovation? We have a unique opportunity here in that we can capitalize on this rapid change and continue to do that to potentially plan a pretty incredible future for the way we deliver education. So prediction number 1, and the funny thing about this prediction is I think institutions realize this now and organizations realize this, but we as education institutions, so those of you representing educational institutions in the call, or those of you that are working closely with them, we need to be ready to change much quicker than we ever have been. Fortunately, and I've been in education my whole career, and I've watched this ebb and flow over time. Educators, while we are incredibly, I believe, gifted and humanitarian people, we tend to like to do things perfectly. And we tend to create particularly public structures around us that don't allow for robust risk-taking. We support pockets of risks, and we make sure that, you know, we encourage people to learn and to grow, but failure isn't always supported in the way it really can be. Failing fast in particular, or taking really big risks, or being really open and transparent about the risks that we're taking. Telling students, I always, in my courses, when I begin my course, I always tell my students, here are the 5 things that you need to know that I am doing very differently in this course. And I do this every semester. I make major changes in my course, not from a workload perspective, but more from just a, how do I approach this so I can learn and grow? And I warn my students, and I say, I'm going to fail. Probably 4 of these are going to fail. But come with me on this journey. Help me support you. And I promise you'll still have the skills and you'll still develop what you're expecting out of this course. But let's venture in this together. We need an environment where that can happen, because the change is coming at us so rapidly, particularly what's coming from that 4th industrial revolution. That's not something that's going to take decades to make changes. That's happening in years. I mean, one of those quotes was, this is what we predict in 2 years from now. So we need to be open and ready for change. And you're going to see in each of my predictions who I think must be most ready. And in this case, organizations. They must create environments where we can allow for that risk taking and that failing fast, but learning constantly. And it's got to be pervasive across the organization. Prediction 2, education will set a much higher bar for the learner experience. This is critical because it's not just about, can I get at it? Can I get at the content? It's about, how do I experience that? And this is where technology really takes ownership. Technology, and I work for a technology company, we must make sure that not only our solutions are learner friendly and have incredible learner experiences, but that our instructors that leverage them and our institutions that leverage them have that access to build those incredible learner experiences. And we need to make sure that the world isn't just about one technology. The world is about an ecosystem. Education is about ecosystems. And we need to be really thoughtful about how we build, connect, and drive learners from one platform to another. Right now, I would say we don't do a very good job. Things may connect, we pass along some authentication, and that's about it. We're not thinking about, what does that full flow look like from a learner experience? And that's up to technology. I mean, that's up to all of us. All of this is, but I would predict that we must focus on this, particularly as technology companies. Third prediction. Education is online technology isn't just going to be table stakes, it's going to be a game changer. If we think of a delivery platform or a video conferencing tool or any publisher content or anything that we're leveraging as a commodity, we're not going to actually use that technology in a meaningful way. We're just using it as a mechanism to transfer information. We're not using it as a way to game change the experience that we're building. I think about a mobile device, right? And transitioning from flip phones to a smart device. And for those of us that have had the ability to do that, a flip phone was kind of table stakes, although probably when it first came out, no, it wasn't. But today it is, right? It's enabling you to make some calls, to receive some calls, and probably get some text messages. A smartphone is allowing you, if you take advantage of that, to do so much more with your device than just the basic table stakes. And yet they're both mobile devices. Now, technologies need to make sure their solutions can be game changers, but really instructors and experience crafters and designers, learning mappers, they're the ones, we're the ones, I'm one of those, that needs to be thinking about how to use technology as game-changing opportunities. My fourth prediction is that we're going to need to think very carefully about how we use data. And this is where this is my call to action to governments in particular. Not that I want governments to regulate this, but I want them to help to facilitate discussions, because there's multiple parties at the table to talk about data. We've got learners, we've got institutions, and we've got providers, technology providers that are capturing that data. And there are different components to data. There's usage data, there's individual personal identifiable information. There's all sorts of data being collected. There's gray data, there's, you name it, there's data being collected. And we need to come together as a community, as an education community, and talk about, okay, what is right for how we're using this data? What are our values behind how we're using this data? And how are we being very transparent to the learner in how that data is being used? This is going to be critical, because the first bad actor we have, and we've had a couple of bad actors in the past. For those of you, go look up the In Bloom saga in higher education. And a lot of these actors don't mean to be bad actors. They just don't have the dialogue to rely on to help guide and how best to use data that's being gathered on learners. But if we have a bad actor, it's going to put us back so far in our ability to innovate that I think we will actually lose our chances of really responding to where the world will go and being a crafter of that. And once again, I'd like to see governments or public organizations or communities supporting them to help craft that dialogue, or at least help encourage it to happen. And then finally, my last prediction, and maybe my simplest one, but I think the most important one. We need to come back to value that human connection and the human itself in learning. So with all of this technology, I was at a conference. I was presenting a presentation at a conference in the Philippines. And one of the things that was said, and I was talking about all these great examples. It's sort of an in-depth version of this, of like 50 different ways, and you can leverage technology today to make pretty profound change in how learners learn and how learners build skills. So in that, a lot of those were very technology rich. And I had a gentleman in the audience ask me, yeah, but how do we teach individuals how to connect with one another? How do we value the human in that? How, we're going to be in a world where there's less and less human connection, and how do we, and I think about everything that's happening in the world today and how the human connection is so important. And so we need to value that, and we need to focus on that. Every one of us, institutions, individuals, designers, all of us need to be thinking about how do we bring that human in, because if we're not careful, we're going to lose that human connection. So those are my quick looking at the past, hopefully a couple of summary ideas and some potential predictions for the future that we can grab onto and think about how do we shape and take this rapid transformation and change opportunity and make a difference in how learning is being delivered.